All right, good afternoon. If you can hear us. The session is about to commence. The session chair, Mr. Femi Adedina, can we have you, please? Confirm that you can hear us. Mr. Adedina, can you confirm that you can hear us, sir?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, do we have the session chair, Femi Adedina?
No, I don't think it's online. I can't see him.
Okay.
Lexi.
Okay, we have Lexi Ochi from the University of Lagos is joining live from here from Lagos. I think we already have we have Emma Onta joining virtually. We have Katrina Okay. Sorry, we do not have Katrina Okay. Nozomi Sawada. Okay, she's joining virtually. And we have also ourselves, we will certainly join virtually. In the absence of the session chair, can we have someone who just to take over chairing this session? Mr. Shola, I don't know if you're able to do this for us.
Okay, I can do that.
All right. So we will proceed now.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Those in the audience, I don't know how many of you are in the audience, and those joining online. My name is Shola Adinekon, and I think I'm just going to make the introduction very brief. Because I think we have how many presenters, including myself? We have 6. So that means we have that's including the respondent herself, ReadersNewell. So that means we all have about 10 minutes to present. Hold on, let me just. I'm going to start with my presentations, and then other people can then follow. But first of all, I want to thank Professor Stephanie Newell, for writing yet another important text looking at spring culture in Africa. And also I want to thank my colleagues, Nozomi Sawada, I think we've met before, Emma Onta, and Kanayo Nomen. So I'm going to start, okay? And then I think I'll be followed by Nozomi. I'm just selecting people now based on what I see on my screen. And then followed by Emma Onta and then Kanayo Nomen. So, okay, I'm going to start now. Stephanie Newell's Newsprint, Literature and Local Literary Creativity in West Africa, 1900s to 1960s, is a combination of a career-long interest in print culture across the African continent with several publications, and I think a co-edited book, I might be wrong, on the subject. It might be more than one, because Stephanie is very prolific. I don't know where she found his strength from. In this book, Newell returns to a familiar terrain, exploring the pioneering journalism editors, fictional writers, poets, and their publics. But it is important to point out that the book is much more than a revisit, because it gives us new and previously under-researched aspects of West African print culture, shows us the networks that enabled print publication, the politics surrounding these networks, as well as how the environment that inspired these publications in turn shaped editors, writers, publications, publisher, and even the publics of these publications. One of the most interesting aspects of this book is its discussions of how editors and readers adopted a certain sartorial English in their writing and interactions. This mimicry reflects the tone adopted by earlier pioneers of journalism and literary culture, who use high flat English language to perhaps mark themselves as intellectual equals to their peers in Victoria-era England. The adoption of what I can see to be some of like upper middle class English accent also became a tool to write back to the colonial empire in a language and accent used by the powerful figures who controlled the empire and who, at that time, deemed Africans as less human than Europeans. The tone that Newell analyzed in this book also points to how language became markers of class and markers of acceptance. They determine who are the foils and who was marginalized. In short, they reflect several of the dynamics that help sustain European ideas about race, class, and gender. For example, in the first chapter, Newell discussed how we rarely hear women's voices, how women's concerns were written out, and how men spoke for women. These factors are also ideas on which colonialism was built. Just bear with me. Newell likewise samples us to the connection between aesthetics and politics. For example, journalists adapted the Victorian era style of writing to suit the local style poem and not constricted in a straitjacket of formalism. On page 28 of the book, she highlights how poets, and I'm quoting now, devise poetry, stripping out rhyme and meter, rendering their sources into prose, and in the process, freely borrowing individual words and distinctive phrases to add beauty and eruditions to their chosen subtopics, unquote. This shows how West African men of letters went beyond merely mimicking their counterparts in Britain, but how mimicry is also a tool of subversion. These authors not only lay claim to the English language, but also challenge that period's notion of poetic aesthetics and freed text from the restraint imposed by those who we had assumed to be the judge of what constitutes poetic aesthetics. Shaw's subversion also reflects how the seed of nationalism and challenges to British authorities in West Africa were not limited to mainstream politics, but may have actually begun in literary text and in journalism. Class consciousness also permeates most chapters in this book, although the author, Newell, does not explicitly devote much energy to the subject. The book narrates how proficiency in the English language became a social marker and a divide that separated those who enjoyed the privilege of colonial education from those who did not enjoy such opportunity. Among the educated, the language is also a source of divisions, as those who expressed themselves in what was considered bad grammar were dismissed as not worthy of due recognition. This division is evidenced in Newell's robust discussion of the public in newspaper journalism. A good example of this is a discussion of letters to the editors, in which she highlights how editors and journalists pay more attention to those readers who have a good command of English, rather than those who may have failed to follow the rules of grammar in their correspondence to the editors. Writers who are adept at using flowery language in their work gain high regard among a section of the print public. And such is the demand for this recognition that some writers embellished their resume and plagiarize work by others writers from the English-speaking world. The case of the character Stuart Young comes to mind, and I find Stuart Young to be a very interesting character. I think probably a short film could be written about this character. Letter to the editors constitute a fertile ground to study the mood of an era, as they provide insight into not just the relationship between writers and the reading public, but also into everyday socio-political developments. I find Newell's discussions of the epistolatory nature of this letter particularly interesting. This letter was not just the reader's response to what had been published, but they also became a forum in which publications and their publics try to influence each other's worldviews. In the context of writer-reader interaction, this book spotlights some of the controversial characters that mark the print culture of the last century, and the counter-publics that challenges misinformation spewed out by some of these publications. And I'm returning back to Stuart Young here. According to the book, he said he was a Nazi sympathizer who derided interracial marriage, but who was sharply rebuked by readers of Comment newspaper. The response of readers to his diatribe illustrate the kind of checks and balances that existed during those years. While news journalism and literature provided impetus for anti-colonial struggles, nationalism and Pan-Africanism, the narrative of Stuart Young and Comment newspapers signposts us to how some of the elites were complicit in the project of colonialism. The second part of the book focuses mainly on Onitsha market literature, another area in which Newell is also a noted authority. From the 1960s onwards, a new network of artisans and lower middle class writers emerged in Eastern Nigeria. Onitsha market literature, which came out from the city of Onitsha, is a good example of a literary network that disrupts the idea that literary networks are mainly constituted of educational middle class. The writers, publishers, and printers and booksellers who made the genre popular were not university educated, but the literature that emerged from this cycle continued to capture literary imaginations in terms of the number of scholarly studies of which Newell is a leading voice. The middle class publications and the artisan publications of Onitsha indulge in some forms of mimicry that evoke the mimicry of some of the elite publications of the previous century. However, it is the public they targeted that differs. This book is important to our understanding of West African literary history, a literary history that is underpinned by the historical conjunctures of the eras that Newell examines. I'm a student of the late Jamaican British thinker, Stuart Hall. And what Newell's books have done is to take me back to Hall's persistent call. I'm reading from my phone, just bear with me, please. Sorry. What Hall calls as to stop, all asking scholar to study the conjunction. That is that moment of danger, of opportunity, a way of intervening if configurations whose components were to be rearranged through practice. A sort of call to action, intellectual action, social, cultural, and political. In this book, Newsprint literature and local literary creativity in West Africa, the study of the conjunction reveals how class became entrenched in the project of colonial modernity, and now it intersects with race and gender. And as I said before, we rarely hear the voice of women and children in these publications. Men spoke for them, both well-educated and also highly educated, felt entitled to speak on, to monitor women's body. And as I said before, some members of the elite became complicit in the project of colonialization. while many others resisted using the language of the colonizer to subvert the colonial project. Body politics was filtered through Euro-modernity and mixed with Euro-Christian didacticism. These publications were also emerged in national, continental, and global politics of their time, the Second World War and the Cold War, of which the assassination of Patrick Lumumba in the Congo provide a veritable reading of how the Onitsha market literature used art to map and convey lived experience. In this period, African writers and journalists were reporting and writing stories from the margins of the global community. But on the continent, in the region, these people were bringing the world into the lives of their publics. These are the historical conjuncture that these books makes me revisit. And I want to thank Professor Newell for this important and easy to read book. The argument flows and the point she was making was actually easy to follow. But I have two questions. I'm just going to round up now. Why did you return to what is for you a very familiar ground? And the second question, there was similar market publication in West Africa, but you focus mainly on Nigeria and Kenya. Is there a particular reason for this? That is it. And I think you can answer these questions at the end, at the end of our group's presentations. Okay, thank you. So I'll now call on Professor Nozomi Sawada to present her paper. Thank you.
Okay, so can I share my screen? Is it okay to share my screen? I don't have the access. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, you've been allowed to share your screen. You can now share your screen.
Okay, can you see it?
Yes,
here?
very good.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Professor Newell, distinguished colleagues, thank you for this valuable opportunity. My name is Nozomi Sawada, and I have been researching the history of newspaper published in early colonial Lagos. And recently, my research integrate digital humanity approach with this print culture history. And first and foremost, I wish to express my deepest respect and gratitude to Professor Newell. Your book, Newsprint Literature and Local Literary Creativity in West Africa is monumental achievement. And for a scholar like myself, who spend her days navigating the microfilm leaves of old Lagos newspapers and the digitalized sea of the text that follows, your book is both compass and like hope, beacon of hope. And today I would like to highlight several of the book's outstanding contributions from three interconnected perspectives that resonate deeply with my own research. First, from the perspective of the social historian, we will begin by examining your re-evaluation of the archive and the concept of local creativity. And second, from the viewpoint of aspiring digital humanity scholar, I will explore how your work built a bridge between close and distant reading, cross-reading and distant reading. And finally, I will touch upon how these insights combine to make a profound contribution to the field of growing importance in my, as I thought, the history of emotions. And after this, I will pose a few questions to open up our dialogue. And so to begin with my first perspective, that the social and literary historian, your book experience lies in how it achieved two deeply interconnected goals. First, you re-evaluate the marginal archive. You have taken newspapers and popular pamphlets long dismissed as ephemeral or trashy and have had reviewed them as brilliant literary spaces. and at the center of West African literary history. And this elaboration in tongue allow for your second equally brilliant contribution, the theoretical deepening of local creativity. By looking inside these archives, you transcend to apply Western concept of mimicry or plagiarism uncritically. And the most vivid example is your analysis in chapter 1 of the Anglo Scribes. For instance, the writer Dick Currey provoked his readers with this language. I would not read it out, but as Professor Newell has shown, this is not mere Shakespearean imitation. This was a highly strategic act, a way of mastering the colonizer's language, demonstrating a level of erudition that suppressed it, and thereby establishing intellectual authority and challenging the colonial discursive space. And by using key concepts like quotation, repetition, and rerouting, you have revealed their creativity as a sophisticated intellectual practice, liberating our understanding of colonial culture production from stereotype. And this brings me to my second perspective, that of a aspiring digital humanities scholar. Your meticulous close reading of these complex text networks, like the one you uncover in chapter 5, is precisely where our field can be. This grand journey of leather writing manual from Britain through America and India to Onisha is a phenomenon where computational approach like text reuse analysis can powerfully complement your qualitative findings. I think with this method, we could begin to quantitatively map the route you've identified, perhaps discover unexpected hubs of transmission, and analyze patterns in what was borrowed versus what was left behind. And this is not to replace your workflows, but to build upon it. And your qualitative analysis provide the essential why question, the cultural logic that explain what one culture called plagiarism, another sees as a legitimate creative practice. And quantitative method in turn can provide the what and how much question. The true potential lies in combining these two approaches, allowing us to see both the forest and the trees of this rich local aesthetics. And finally, this synergy between close reading and distant reading allow us to appreciate your book's profound contribution from my third perspective, its contribution to the history of emotions in Africa. Professor Newell's work does not just analyze text, it historicizes feeling itself. For instance, your analysis of Shagilola weeping in chapter 2 is a brilliant case study in history of sentimentality. When you show us how Shagilola performance, great sobs are shaking me on page 55 is not a spontaneous outburst, but what you described as on page 39, textual strategies for feminine subjectivity, drawing on a 200-year-old European epistolary tradition. You reveal how specific feelings were constructed, performed, and circulated through the medium of newsprint. And this is particularly fascinating because it shows how colonial subjects strategically approached Western literary conventions to create their own emotional repertoires. And inspired by your groundbreaking work, I have found several new questions in my own field. And I would be honored if you would share your thoughts later in this session. My first question is about textual materiality. You showed us page 180, that leaders did not treat these newsprint as ephemeral, but as items to be bound and kept for the coming posterity. Given that digitalization erases material context, and given your concept of the anti-ephemeral, how essential do you consider these physical features, like the paper, the layout, the ink, to be understanding the local aesthetics you have uncovered? And what do you think is irrevocably lost? What do you think is lost when a newspaper becomes a digital text? And my second question concerns the continuity of unruly archives. And in your conclusion, you draw a fascinating parallel between colonial newsprint and contemporary social media, and noting the fluidity of laws and the confounding of orthodox analysis on page 184 to 185. You analyze the creative practice of quotation, repetition, and reloading throughout the book, and how do you see these historical aesthetics resonating with today's meme and remix culture? And Tibor James Yake's phrase that you cite on 185, page 185, the act of self-inscription into the performance of another, has this fundamental logic of African creative unruliness changed over 100 years, or has only the medium changed? And my final question concerns the emotional textures of those beyond the elite, a question that stems from the limits of my own research. Your work brilliantly show that even written emotional scripts, like Shaggy Lola's Weeping in Chapter 2, a fictional, Weeping in Chapter 2, a fictional fallen woman created by the male editor Thomas, are not transparent expression, but performed literary cause. This highlights the fundamental challenge for any kind of sentimental analysis. This leads me to an even more difficult question. If interpreting the written emotion is this complex, how can we even begin to approach the unwritten emotion landscape of the majority? Maybe it's not answerable. It's difficult to answer, but in your research, did you find any clues, perhaps in description of market scene or the court cases, that hint at a different emotional repertoire of feeling loose among the non-literary public, which exists outside the literary conventions you analyzed? Well, these are my questions, and thank you very much for listening to my presentation today. Your book, as you stated on page 2, asks how the approaches to Anglophone African literature on the one hand and African culture on the other hand might be extended. And this is indeed a fundamental question that continues to guide our field. And your book does not just ask this question, and it provides us with a powerful new way to begin answering it. So once again, I express my deepest gratitude to Professor Stephanie Newell for this tremendous contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your contributions, Professor Sada. Next presenter will be Professor Emma Hunter. It's all yours now.
Wonderful, thank you. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Is the sound okay? Great. Good afternoon, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here I'm a historian of East Africa, so coming at this book from that perspective, and really want to start by echoing what's been said already. A huge thank you to Stephanie for this book and for all the other contributions which have really shaped and reshaped certainly how I think about print cultures in Africa. And huge congratulations on this really wonderful book. It was an absolute joy to read. I think if anyone in the room hasn't read it, you will be hearing that from all of us, that it's a joy to read. And as in all of your work, Stephanie, it brings to life the energy and vibrancy of the print culture of the first half of the 20th century in West Africa in really powerful ways. And for me as a historian, this sort of immersion that as a reader of this book, immersion in what Stephanie terms local literary cultures, it means that we can understand those literary cultures, what was esteemed and valued, what was deemed unworthy of appearing in print and excluded. But it also helps us to view some of the very familiar historical events of the 20th century with new eyes, from the perspective of those who were writing and producing texts in these literary cultures. And I was particularly struck by this in the discussion of nationalism in chapter 4. And of course, the history of nationalism has been written and rewritten many times. We have a sense of what who the individuals are who are shaping the history of nationalism, of how to think about nationalism and independence. But in that chapter, you very quickly and briskly decenter some of the people we would normally think to go to understand that history. Somebody like Chinua Achebe, who we think of as the quintessential nationalist writer, you point out his books were printed on very expensive paper. They were published overseas. For many people, these books were unaffordable and out of reach. But meanwhile, readers and writers of locally produced pamphlets were producing their own visions of the future in ways which captured that forward-looking dimension of that particular historical moment in the middle 20th century. And the same was true in chapter 8, where you analyze the Lumumba pamphlets. Again, I felt myself seeing those very familiar events, those sort of iconic moments of the 20th century, like the assassination of Lumumba, those moments of the Cold War, from a different perspective to the perspective we're used to, both from the historical literature in the sense of the kind of big international histories that tell us the Cold War through the lens of the superpowers, the US, USSR, China, but also a different perspective from some of the more recent global and transnational histories, which are focusing on what was happening in Africa, but they're doing so from the perspective of the mobile transnational elites, the students, the lecturers, rather than from the perspective we see here, centering the perspectives of Nigerian local intellectuals and I'll come back to this term, local, later on, and getting us to what they were saying and writing and thinking about colonialism and neo-colonialism. And for me, this really opens up the intellectual history of mid-20th century Africa in such exciting ways, and it's just wonderful to read that. The focus of the book is on those who chose, and you insist on the fact that this was a choice, that chose to write in English, and that the description of those who write in English as not Anglophones but Anglo-literates or Anglo-scribes, I thought that was very helpful in thinking about what it means to write and read in English. But what I also really appreciated was the way that consistently those Anglo-scribal or Anglo literate writers are part of that wider environment, a wider context of languages other than English, of oral forms, and also, as in the chapter on female critical communities, in the context of operating in the context of a wider public opinion, which these texts are interacting with and shaping, and there's a back and forth. So we get that sense of the hinterland, of that wider ecology coming through really, really strongly. I also really appreciate the way in this book you question and interrogate aspects of 20th century print cultures that perhaps we sometimes haven't interrogated in quite the way you do here. And again, it was that chapter on female critical communities where I really felt that. I think there's a sense in a lot of the writing about print cultures that these are gendered spaces, these are predominantly male spaces, and that's recognized, that's accepted. But what I got here was that sense of actually what it means to do that, the violence and aggression in terms of how women and women's oral styles were forcibly diminished and excluded, and that really challenged me to think about some of my my sources and some of the newspapers I've written about in ways that I haven't before. And more broadly, that chapter as a whole, I think, was a brilliant example of what we can see when we think differently about our archive. Though at the same time, it did leave me wishing I had a time machine to go back and find the texts that were written by women, the one that perhaps is no longer extant, perhaps others that we don't know about, or to talk to the women who, as you say, may have been the first readers of many of these publications. So I could continue for a long time on all the wonderful aspects of this book. I do hope it will inspire more historians of Africa to turn to this enormous archive of local publications as a resource to help us better understand the cultural history of modern Africa. So the point that Nozomi ended with as well. But let me turn now to a couple of broader reflections and questions, which come from my perspective as a historian of East Africa. So I've recently finished a co-authored book with Ismay Milford, Jared McCann, and Dan Branch, which explores intellectual and political cultures of East African regionalism in the middle 20th century. And so there was quite a lot here that felt really familiar, that I thought, yeah, that I can see some of the parallels between these two very different contexts. But there were also differences, and a big difference which comes up in not just in the middle 20th century, but in earlier periods as well, is about money and finance and funding, and where the money comes from, what are the conditions of production for print cultures. And in the book, you refer to the shock of discovering the extent of Cold War funding, in short, of Congress for Cultural Freedom, ultimately CIA funding of literary endeavours. And the example he uses the Currey Conference of African Writers of English Expression. And in our book, another sort of key moment in the same vein is the moment later in the decade when it transpires that Rajat Nioji's Transition magazine is funded by CCF and again ultimately CIA funding. But in East Africa, one of the things that we've been sort of tracing in that book is the multitude of funders. There's so many foundations and different kinds of bodies are putting money into publications that kind of look local, but they're being supported by these sort of quiet flows of money. And more than that, books are being sent from China, Russia, UK, America, bits to go into newspapers similarly are being sent, and those are contributing to shaping those public spheres. And it's not always obvious to tell where that text comes from. So archives like the archive of the Information Research Department, which was part of the UK Foreign Office, which undertook anti-communist propaganda activity, reveals some aspects of how communist and anti-communist texts were traveling, who they were being sent to, who was sort of doing that work of putting some of these texts in, but not all. It's hard to trace some of those sorts of connections. And again, speaks to that kind of wider question about sort of conditions of production. So I found myself wanting to know a bit more about the money, about the how publications were funded. How did the business models work that made it viable? Who were the local elites who were willing to put their money into new ventures? How did local intellectuals kind of support themselves to make the time to do this work of intellectual production, and that does come through in the book. But I would have loved to know more, but that would have been a different book. The second reflection, I want to go back to the question of the local. And again, that's coming from something that I really struggle with in my own work, and it's about this term local. So in the introduction, you lay out really clearly how you're using that term, that you're using it as a productive critical category. I quote, quoting here, productive critical category, marking the presence of creative agency that is more subtle than implied by the conventional usage of local as a marker of lesser, narrower, more parochial cultural concerns in opposition to global or cosmopolitan positions. And I think that the challenge is that conventional usage that is so powerful and is so often the default understanding of those we're talking to, whether that's other scholars or whether it's a wider public. And I think that makes it really hard to use that term in this critical, but actually really, really generative and productive way. So, and that's, you know, it's an experience that I've had when I've been trying to sort of use that term in those similar ways. So I guess my question, and this is a selfish question because it's something, as I say, I really struggle with, is how do we as scholars then proceed in reclaiming this term and turning it to creative and critical ends? But thank you again so much for this wonderful book, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Hunter. And then we have the last, our last presenter, last but not the least, is Professor, let's say, Ochibejve. I hope I've pronounced it very well. I think I might have made some mistake in the pronunciation, but you can correct me, please. I hear that you are in the audience, so if you can sit beside the technical guy so that we can see you. Please come to the floor. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lexi Ukibeji. It's a very difficult name.
Thank you.
A very difficult name to pronounce, but people like us, it's quite easy. Having said that, I want to join others to congratulate Professor Stephanie Newell on the publication of her new book. I particularly salute the energy she has used to gather data that people are beginning to forget. And not only gathering those data, she has been able to intelligently analyze the data and make perfect statements with them. Stephanie, I'm not about to give an overview of what the book is all about. I'm just going to give my perspective on certain areas of the book that I think that fascinates me. I've talked about the data that she has gathered, data from newsprints, from pamphlets, from how-to texts, how not to text. In fact, when I saw that, I was particularly very fascinated with the idea of how not to text, and political manifestos, letters, as well as letters on advice. Stephanie Newell's book takes us to the old but useful arguments regarding what constitutes actual literature and what is to be regarded as the literary. And before now, people have always had a skewed idea about what literature should be classified under. But this book has reignited our sense of understanding and puts us in shape regarding, what should constitute the literary. Then again, the book also, because of the data that Professor Stephanie Newell has gathered and has analyzed also makes us realize the inexhaustibility of literature and what is to be regarded as the literary, that just anything can be regarded as literature, provided you are able to make perfect statements with them regarding culture, regarding human life in general. And so she has been able to do that perfectly well. Then the area that I find so fascinating is the inadequacies and the adequacies that she has been able to show in the data that she has selected. For example, when she measured on newsprint literature, newsprints from newspaper men has always been conceived as, for information purpose, for information dissemination. But these newspaper men have been able to see some inadequacies, some potentials that the newsprint has, that the newsprint has the possibility, has the ability to adopt, to accommodate other perspectives, other creative endeavors that will equally interest readers. So as they accommodate, as they incorporate those things into their newspaper outfits, like the Comet, like Arcade Echo, something like that. I don't know whether I got that correctly. But by doing that, the innovation that these newspaper men brought to their newsprints, they have been able to show that there are certain potentials in the newsprint that have gone untapped, that have gone unexplored, and there is a need to look at that, those particular aspects, those potentials, the abilities of the newsprints. Then when she takes us to pamphlets, as can be found in the Onitsha market tradition, there is also a sense of novelty that she brings into how the pamphlets were able to be used not only for educational purpose, but for general readers to realize the class of people that pioneered this category of pamphlets. For example, the Onitsha market phenomenon, the pamphlet, the Onitsha market tradition, measured on and makes us realize that there are certain literature that are sourced from the popular imagination. So the interest of such literatures, the interest of such materials will be on the common people, will be on people on the streets, will be on market women, will be on drivers, will be on gardeners. And so there is a connection between the form of those particular literature and the themes that come out from them. And so when she takes us to epistolary, traditionally, exchange of letters, exchange of correspondence between two persons. Again, we also find that some persons, writers as at then, now took it as a kind of, they spotted a kind of inadequacy, that rather than looking at letters as just a means of correspondence, there can also be a way that such letters can be used to give advice, can be used to better the human experience. And so it's quite fascinating that she has been able to show all of that in her work. Then there is also the idea of, what I find so fascinating again, is the idea of counter forms, or what I want to regard as intra-counter forms. For example, when we have the epistolary, we have letters that have to do with correspondence, just letters that have to do with exchange of ideas. Now, it now proceeded from that. We now have forms within the epistolary that just are proposed to give ideas, to give advice, So the understanding of what constitutes the literary I spotted that in the newsprints. I spotted that in pamphlets. I spotted that in auto text. From auto text, it now emanates into R-not-to text. You see how forms are responding to other forms within their forms. And of course, we have political manifestos that, because such writers are concerned about the experiences of Africans, particularly West Africa, they now use certain political manifestos, certain species, especially certain African personalities as a means of educating the general populace. And as at that particular time, people were eager to actually know certain individuals that they know not about before. So she has been able to perfectly gather those data and use those data to pass information that are very vital, not only to providing information to people, but also to expand the understanding of what constitutes the literary. So I will not want to repeat what other participants have spoken, but I just have two questions emanating from my reading of the book. So I'll just ask the question as I conclude. The first question I want to ask has to do with, I put the question, so what do you think, Professor Newell, what do you think is the future of the primary data that you have used in your book? Having analyzed newsprint, having analyzed pamphlets, epistolary, what do you think is the future of this data that you have gathered and have analyzed? Secondly, do you think the act of assembling, because you did talk about the assemblage of one particular form with the other, what do you think is the act of assembling in the literary innovation from West Africa? How has it influenced, analyzed? Do you think that it has influenced certain writers who now write today, people like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who mixes social blogging platform and the normal tradition of novel, as can be found in a book, Americana, and then also a writer like Igoni Barrett. You see Igoni Barrett mixing, weaving the social media platform, Facebook interaction, Facebook and Facebook exchange of messages within the context of the novel. So we see in those novels where we have the features of the novel, and we also have features of the social media, as can also be found in the data that you have selected. So my question is, how do you think that what you have done, you have been able to use the writers who have done all of this, have been able to influence contemporary writers in West Africa of today? So having said that, I would like to once again congratulate Professor Stephen Newell on the publication of this fantastic book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Unfortunately, we should have had one more speaker, Kakarina Oke, but she emailed that she's unable to make it today. So what we're going to do then is to move straight on to let our guest, the person we'll be talking about, to actually take the floor and respond to our review and comments. So the floor is yours, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Shola, for chairing. And just to say hello to everybody, I'm really sorry not to be in Lagos for this. I love the hybrid conference. I'm so delighted to be able to be here. But of course, the sociability of, particularly with these conversations, the questions that each panelist has raised could just form hours and hours of conversation, and I'm so grateful to the panelists. Very moving, actually. I've been, I think you've been very generous indeed, and thank you for engaging so deeply with this book project. As I think you've all gathered, it's my big one. It's the one that it's 30 years of work. It's I started out in the Onitsha Market Literature Archive when I was doing my PhD. That's exactly the archive that got me fascinated with locally published literature. So, and in a way, it's sort of beginning to approach the first question that Shola asked. Why return to the familiar ground? Because in 30 years of work, and it touches on Emma's point as well about and Nozomi, well, all of you really talking about the issue of the kind of sheer quantity of data that we've got this unmanageable, unwieldy archive. How do we approach it qualitatively? How do we approach it? Do we, in terms of Nozomi's question, how do we track currents and shifts and historical movements across the sheer quantity of this material? And so there's so much to address across your various presentations. But yes, that question, why return to the familiar ground? Really, I felt it was only possible to write this book now after 30 years because of having been immersed in American newspapers for at least 20 of those 30 years, really, reading the archives, reading the newspapers, reading entire print runs of particular papers, stepping back from that, comparing them with other newspapers. So there's a way that this project, it is familiar, but it's also it's new ground to me because I just felt that I had enough immersion in the sheer quantity of material to be able to perhaps make some connections across between newspaper cultures and early pamphlet literature in the 50s and the 60s. And that again touches on Nozomi's very important point about the materiality of these texts, the actual paper that they're produced on, the quality of the print, the way they're preserved in the archives, the way they're bound up, the way they're reformatted. You've got there's ways that I wanted to make connections between the very paper that newspapers and pamphlets are printed on, not only in terms of their affordability, but in terms of what newsprint makes possible in terms of local literary expression. So I'm really trying to kind of think across your various presentations in making these comments. And I found I didn't want to create teleologies, I didn't want to create straight lines out of early newspapers into mid-century pamphlets forward, that kind of that idea of moving forward. I felt that was quite a simplistic way. It's often used by literary scholars to kind of impose teleologies, impose lineages. Then you would see Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie coming directly out of a particular sort of past genre, and I felt those kind of models for thinking about literary emergence were kind of quite useful in terms of contextualizing writers, but not that useful in terms of looking at how genres were negotiated and shaped, and what the kind of experiments that were taking place with different kinds of text. And so I kind of wanted to have my cake and eat it in this book by having a sense of how newspaper cultures generated the kind of writing communities, and also a lot of the aesthetic frameworks that pamphlet writers picked up on when they wrote pamphlets in the 50s and the 60s. So there's your lineage, but I also wanted to break the linearity of that by looking at these printed forms as even the word experimental is slightly problematic to me because it implies that the experiment yields a result later on. And I didn't want to impose that sort of lineage. So it's a weird kind of history that I'm doing. It's sort of looking at individual examples for the sort of ebullience and for what they're doing and then sort of taking those individual examples and putting them next to each other to see perhaps what's shared in terms of approaches or ways of thinking about quotation and borrowing and sources and things like that, but probably slightly overdoing the kind of refusal of the bigger picture. And that's something that's come through in all of your presentations, actually. It's perhaps it's a methodological issue for us as historians and literary scholars. You know, when you've got such a vast archive, how do you manage it? What do you do? How do you kind of respect the individuality of the materials and the voices that you're encountering, but also make those bigger connections? And in different ways, I think we're all asking that. You know, Nozomi in particular, with thinking about, you know, putting qualitative in relation to quantitative and thinking about digital humanities projects, but also this, you know, the image of the forest and the trees, you know, the sort of, and thinking as well about, you know, the local and the global. And so in a way, like each of us in our own ways, we've got these kind of sort of queries about where we locate ourselves in relation to the archive, how we make the connections between the big picture and that very, very kind of like packed archive. And, you know, and I think that would be an absolutely wonderful topic, actually, for an edited collection, to be thinking methodologically about these kind of issues without reintroducing perhaps the binaries that we need at the moment to think about them, be it between quant and qual, or forest and trees, or, you know, the local and global. So there's all kinds of ways that your responses are kind of provocative to me about, you know, how much of the bigger picture, or the sort of broader perhaps regional and continental and global issues are. I mean, you'll see in the book, I just absolutely kind of obsessively, I insist on the local as the starting point for thinking about those bigger issues. But it was a sort of, it made possible that book, but I don't particularly agree with that position as a sort of, it's not like, I don't think we should all be doing that. I think it was really useful for this book, but so much gets lost in the process of doing that. In particular, what gets lost are comparisons, you know, perhaps between, say, Francophone and Anglo literate, as I'm calling them, print cultures in West Africa, but the, you know, comparative nationalisms in the mid-century, really interesting in terms of how creative writers engaged with, you know, and you know, as several of you were mentioning, those kind of networks, you know, Emma in particular, like how the actual circulation of texts, that is so much more than, however generous we are in the word local, the dissemination of text, the way they're picked up, the way, you know, the funding, the money, the sponsorship, all of these are deserve histories of their own. So you can see I'm not answering your questions at all. I'm just sort of, I'm marking them, acknowledging them, and hoping to have more discussion about it, really. I feel I ought to look at some of your individual questions, but I'm really there's so much to think about. I mean, Nozomi, wow, your each of your questions, each sub question within your broader question was just so rich and so exciting, and, you know, really, really provocative. And I really want to think about those, and would like to be writing to you individually to sort of think about your questions. So perhaps I could just, like, I'm just going to literally spot check my notes and pick a couple of things out, and then hopefully circle back to you, and you can perhaps come back in with emphases that we can talk about with the people that are in the room in Lagos as well. I was very taken by Nozomi, by the way you talked about emotions and the history of the emotions, and it made me think that this project, that this book I've produced is a little bit evasive. You were asking beyond genre, within texts, you are asking perhaps for sincerity, where to locate emotional sincerity, while also very strongly recognizing and acknowledging the way that these are textual strategies with histories, and that the expression, let's say with Shekilola, the expression of her emotions are very much a sort of, that they are textual strategies. But I do really take your point, and I think it may be a bit evasive of me to call those strategies. And I've been thinking about, you know, how might one look at sort of emotional changes, emotional expressions, you know, over historically. And I think your quantitative approach actually is the way of doing that. That because we're looking at the, you know, these are popular cultural forms that we're looking at here, and mass-produced popular cultural forms. And I would we can still respect the individuality of the author's voices while also looking for areas of repetition and particular phrases that might recur, and then we can look to historicize those. So, because one of my concerns about the history of the emotions approach is that emotions are perhaps taken as static rather than changing over time. And you know, one might have a particular word for an emotion, but it's not the same over time, nor is it the same in different contexts. So perhaps like models that might be developed by, I don't know, psychologists in the global north now are not that useful for thinking about the expression of emotions that one picks up on in English language newspapers and pamphlets. So there's all kinds of really interesting questions about that. But I think what I would say, again, it's a kind of methodological question about, look, you know, to read for something that you might call sincerity, or you might have a better word for it than that. Perhaps where authors do repeat particular emotional expressions, you know, it's exactly that moment of quotation repetition that we can't call plagiarism and we can't call mimicry, you know, that it's so perhaps, you know, from a quantitative point of view, there's ways that repetitions could be looked at as forms of emotional expression of within genres, within texts, but in particular periods. So that's certainly got me thinking a lot. Emma, the idea of the local, yes, you know, you kind of were saying how, yeah, because of the identification of the local with parochial and over and against global, you know, can we reclaim it? Can we? I found it more useful than every day. I found it more useful than popular. It's the most kind of because there's a sense of historicity and specificity and placement that goes with the word local for me. So that's, but again, that would be something for a lot more discussion. I think I could justify the term local and release it from that kind of dichotomy, but still, you know, but yes, it's definitely something that needs to be kind of continuously rethought, and I'd make a case for claiming it, you know, and make, yeah, it's useful right now. Now Lexi, and I hope also, Shola, I hope I've been addressing your idea of the rest of Africa, you know, why I've only focused on Nigeria, and I hope my comments about the sheer quantity of the data and you know, are kind of the sort of practical issues around being immersed in an archive, and can you be immersed to the same extent in a comparative archive? That I've always said this, that newspaper and pamphlet research, newspapers in particular, require communities of researchers to continuously compare notes. I think, Emma, you've written this as well. I've seen you write about this, that we need to collaborate, because just reading one print run of one newspaper, reading one print run of the Comet took me 2 years just for that. So for textured comparison across regions and even across titles, I think it demands collaborative research, which is a bit of a wriggling out of your question, because I take your point about comparative frameworks, and Emma as well, around issues of comparison. And these, maybe we can come back to these in a little while. I'm gonna talk for maximum 3 more minutes. Lexi, I absolutely loved how you talked about, although we got cut off at one point, but you talked about forms responding to other forms within their forms. I just thought that was absolutely brilliant, and that you really did beautifully capture what I was trying to do in the project, although I didn't put it like that. I wish I had. And then you moved from that to think about kind of ideas of assemblage, and how authors like perhaps Chimamanda and Igoni Barrett, how they mix different types of media, different media forms into their fiction. So there's all kinds of interesting. There's, I think, with both of them, with both of the examples you gave, I thought they were being quite sort of bounded in their borrowings. They're like, now I'm including Facebook or text messages or social media. This is in my novel, right? So, whereas the stuff that I looked at from earlier is so kind of unbounded. It's like there isn't necessarily, letters are useful, how-to pamphlets are useful, but the genres are continuously being expanded, and that the genres themselves are so flexible that they're constantly being like negotiated with readers, negotiated with other authors. Whereas I think both Barrett and Adichie kind of have quite a closed idea of the particular form that they're making use of in their text. That might be closing down discussion a bit. So I'd welcome your comments back on that. And yeah, Lexi, again, your question about the future of the primary data. I slightly cautiously, in the very final chapter of the book, in the conclusion, I started to think about social media and the sort of like how perhaps in terms of the sheer profusion of material available to newspaper researchers and pamphlet researchers, that there may be connections we can make with social media research, that idea of the unruly archive. I haven't read enough social media texts in terms of creative writing to really be confidently saying there's a sort of genealogy there, but I think very much in terms of like relationships with readers, flexibility around genre, there's all kinds of ways that social media creativity and the sheer profusion of data, I think, is more of a could be very useful for people approaching newspaper archives. So there's ways that we can definitely think across media when we've got these gigantic archives. And Nozomi, I'm sure you would have something to say about that, given your digital humanities work. How do you, there's the language of scraping and assembling, and are there approaches from social media and digital research that could be applicable, especially in the newspaper archives that are not digitized? Like, how do we approach those? And there's a huge swathe of those from like 1922 and before. A lot of newspapers have not been digitized, but those are all questions that I'd be really keen to talk more about. So there we go. I went 1 minute over my promise, but let me go back to you, and with just huge thanks for your very interesting and wonderful engagement with the book.
Thank you. You have the authorial license anyway to go over the limit you allocate there to yourself. I just wonder whether people in the audience would like to respond to the author, and also maybe ask questions as well to members of the panels. Anyone in the audience? No? I can't see the floor, so if you want to come forward.
We don't have any questions from members of the audience here.
Say again, please.
We don't have questions.
No questions.
Here.
Okay. 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 Co-panelists, do you have any response or counter response to what to Stephanie's response?
From someone online.
Okay, can you send it to me? Okay, what's the question, please? Oh, okay, let's check. I think you just Kylie Coates here. Kylie Coates here. But that's not just, it's not a question. Thank you for this wonderful book.
I want to respond very short. Can I just say something?
Yes, please, go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for this rich and thoughtful response about the historical dimension of emotion and their function, affect function, and your point about not treating emotion as static and the importance of understanding them in local context is particularly valuable for my research. I asked their question, which was very difficult for me. So I wanted to ask you your thought and the sentimental analysis of the historical text itself is the things a bit problematic. However, I started my project, so I wanted to see, I wanted your thought and would like to have inspiration. So thank you. And your emphasis on how emotion change across time and context resonate deeply with what I'm trying to explore and didn't make it. And I'm particularly interested in how specific emotion expression function and transform across different periods and text. But maybe it would be difficult to do it with quantitative research. So I should go back and forth between quantitative and qualitative research and combine it somehow and make it. Would like to use it for my project. Thank you very much.
And perhaps I could just come back to you on that, Nozomi, because while you were talking, I was thinking about whether, in terms of this material that we're looking at and even the quantification of it, whether you can ever release emotions from genre and from textuality. And I really don't think so. So your question about the beyond text, that's something to really think about. Perhaps it's not a possible question in this type of research, but one of the reasons that I answered the way I did to you is because thinking about romantic love, right? So the emotion of romantic love, and I mean romantic love, not just love, right? So the expression of romantic love, the way that Onitsha pamphleteers make use of romantic discourse is really fascinating because they I found almost unanimously, not completely, but like 99% of authors writing romances would lift material from high, sincere, romantic British literature, whether it's popular literature or even older, going right the way back to the 17th century, or from Romeo and Juliet, for example, that's quoted a lot. So you get the expression of romantic sentiment in Onitsha romances each and every time, except for the 1%, each and every time that material is used and quoted. It's not used to show romantic sincerity. It's used to warn against people who use that type of language. They cannot be trusted. They are they're going to abuse you and exploit you. And time and again you get, so you've got this critique of the quoted material in its original format. Perhaps there's also parody and critique. I don't know enough about the various sources, but you know, I would imagine, I think Shakespeare, there was a certain element of parody in Romeo and Juliet, for example, but I might be alone in that. But you know, to quote saying that's high sentimental romance appears to be sincere and authentic declaration of love. When you read the pamphlets, the authors are saying, do not trust anybody, any man who uses this language. The best kind of language for love is simple, efficient, and plain. And that is the quote marriage kind of love. So you've got this really interesting example where like sentimentality, romantic love is being critiqued, and it's the genre and the language of that that's being critiqued in order to highlight how the emotion of love. I mean, again, sometimes I don't know whether to call something an emotion or whether it's a sort of umbrella term, and there are sort of, you know, again, classing emotions is almost impossible. But you know, there's ways that you can trace emotive discourse through different texts in the form of repetitions, but also kind of historicize them and see how they perhaps are being critiqued, that's the qualitative approach, I guess.
Yeah, your response inspired me to look at the repetitive kind of phrases or the themes that appeared in newspaper would be more useful than like now I'm doing kind of trying to view the overview of the emotion and classify somehow. However, I would like to look at that a bit more deeply about what is repeated, and they're coming back again and again. So thank you very much.
I think you can make the quantification, but it's in order to see how that is critiqued, not to apply it. Do you see what I mean? Like you can quantify in order to look at instances of that to see how it's being interrogated or reworked or applied. You know, so there's those kind of quantifications are useful to create a limit. That would be the most useful way of using the emotions, I think.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'm going to return to the question posed by Professor, let's say, Ochibeibe. And that question revolves around the future of the data that you've used. What is the future of that data? Because that's the question also I'm asking myself regarding my own current work. What's the future of the data that I'm gathering, going to the archives, retrieving this data from the archives? Are we going to digitize them? And also, if I've digitized some, what am I going to do with the rest that I've not been able to digitize? So, as you know, as the panelists ask, what's the future of your data?
I kind of want to throw it back to you, Shola. I really do, because you've got a really major project. You're thinking about specifically these issues, and I think I'd want to hear more from you about this. I mean, in conversation, I know that, you know, that sounds a bit disingenuous of me to do that, but you really are working with those questions right now. Have you got a way of answering it, and might it connect up with a kind of, you know, the quantitative approach that Nozomi's thinking about?
I mean, what I'm doing is, so what we've done in our team, not just me, my colleagues and I, is to find a way of digitizing this material, what we consider as endangered. Because when you are very familiar with the archives in Ibadan, you're very familiar with the archives in Ghana as well. You find that a lot of this material, especially when we're talking about the era that you look at, a lot of this material actually could be considered actually endangered. We've digitized some and we left we gave them to the archive at Ibadan so that other people can actually use it. And now we are looking at digitizing materials where for the TV stations looking at their Yoruba materials as well. So I think the complaint that I encountered at the beginning when I was doing background research for the project was that we just come from Europe or America, we take this data, we publish our book, and then we move on. That we always forget them, and they were very reluctant to work with me. And I have to reassure them this is actually what we want to do. And it's a question I'm not asking you, just you. It's a question I asked Saeed, I didn't ask where as everybody who is doing similar work to what we're doing. What are we going to do with this data? And I think it's a question that I'm not challenging. It's a question that I think we need to come together and think about. And I think the term that Emma Hunter was using about this community working together in community, and I think you use that phrase as well. Maybe forming a community to actually maintain and create a future for this data.
And to be able to catalogue it in a way that connects all together, so that each individual digitization project isn't happening on is connected across, so that a researcher, wherever they are in the world, can make those connections across. I mean, on Onitsha market literature, for example, the biggest collection is in the British Library in London, and it doesn't seem right to me that you need to be able to afford an airfare and accommodation and all the rest of it in order to go and look at for Nigerians, or for anybody outside of London to be able to go and visit that archive. I think, just in terms of in terms of access and repatriation, these things can happen through digital means. With archives like all the archives that I've looked at are outside of copyright in terms of what's on Nietzsche pamphlets. Obviously, there's issues of copyright that need to be considered with any kind of digitization project, but actually, I would argue very strongly for every single one of the 1,000 or so on Nietzsche pamphlets held at the British Library to be digitized and made available to whichever scholar wishes to read them. But of course, that's an ideal. That is an ideal.
Thank you. And then on that note, I think we just about run out of time. I want to thank you, Stephanie, for writing a wonderful book, something I'm going to be using in my work as I come to the end of my own project. And also I want to thank each and every one of the panelists for their insights, your thoughtfulness, and also those in the audience as well for taking the time out to be part of this experience. For this an experience. And then good luck with the rest of the conference. And bye for now.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right,
Bye,
bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.